Welcome, everyone. Standing room only, which is fantastic to see. There's some new faces here for me, so welcome. Bridge Street Fellowship is a group of men who gather to explore real life. It's a safe place where what we talk about here stays here. We talk about how faith intersects with our life, and we do that through listening to people speak to us about their life. We are absolutely honoured today to have Al Stewart with us, speaking to us. Some of you know Al, but Al, of course, is National Director of the the Fellowship of Independent Evangelical Churches, but was a time in leadership positions in City Bible Forum, Geneva Push, KCC, and also was a bishop of the Anglican Church at one time. On a more personal note, Al is one of my favourite people. He was instrumental in bringing me back to my faith 15 years ago, and also officiated at my father's wedding, who in a biblical endeavour of optimism got remarried at the age of 80. So, as I said, Al's one of my favourite people. We're actually got a twofer today because Oliver is going to be interviewing Al, and of course Oliver spoke a few weeks ago and is the founder of Bridge Street. So thank you to both, and please welcome.
Thanks, Walter. Have we got any new people here today? First timers? Great. Well, welcome. Nice to see you. Hope you enjoy it today. So, Al, this feels a bit strange for me interviewing you.
Just a little, and we all know there's just a gap in the roster, and so Oliver and Peter look around and say, right, gap, reserves bench. You. So right. Now that that's out in the open, we can all relax.
Okay. I was wondering whether you were going to bring that up.
No, well, just
yeah.
Yeah. Always put the dead cat on the table, and then
right.
We relax.
You notice how Al doesn't need a microphone to. So Al, they say that you're an author now. This is. I mean, we heard all your CV here, and it's all very impressive. But you know, author Al Stewart, author, right?
Anybody can write a book. Yep.
And the book that we're talking about today really is this book, the manual. Has everybody got a copy of this?
By the way, I don't get any royalties from this. I don't have a dog in the fight financially, so I don't mind giving it a push.
How do people get a hold of this book?
All right, there's an order there.
Okay.
Pete's got a thing running, or you can go to Matthias Media online and just buy it. Matthias Media, the manual, bang, hit the button, credit card, they'll send it to you.
Yeah.
So,
and are you on a speaker's tour, Al?
The phone has rung just a little bit, yes, in terms of come and speak at our men's event, etc. So, yep, one or two of the guys here have got me as well this year, and next year's pretty full already, actually.
Right. Have you been invited to any women's events?
No, actually I haven't. But I have told women they can read the book if they want. Yeah.
What was the reaction?
Oh yeah, some of them are curious. Yeah.
Right.
But mostly it's been blokes.
Okay.
But
good.
It has been read by the first editor was a woman who's kind of cast her eye across the whole thing, and some of the lumpy bits were massaged, shall we say?
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Well, what really inspired you to write this book?
I spent a lot of my life, and have spent a lot of my life, the last 40 years, talking with men, and I am aware that particularly young men are more and more lost in terms of how do you live out life as a man, productively on the front foot rather than passively. I think that's a growing problem. And then also, as a Christian minister, and I've worked at that for 35 years, there is a conspiracy to emasculate Christian men. And so I made it one of my missions in life to try and reverse that as well.
Okay.
And I just care about blokes. And so this is me trying to put some thought, some wisdom and some positivity into the whole thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Good on you. And who's doing the emasculation?
I think the emasculation can come from. All right, I'm just going to say it, and then
Spit it out.
Yeah, I think sometimes Christian leaders can emasculate the whole thing because we live with the tyranny of niceness. Jesus says, "Be loving," and being loving is not the same as being nice. Right. Being nice is just kind of having no sharp edges so people will like you. Loving is doing what's best for other people. And so, is that kind of, and we explain the Christian message as, Jesus is your boyfriend and all that sort of thing. So, and that's not the case.
Right.
So, and so often churches are run to appeal to women. I heard a mate of mine as a farmer say one day, when I hear ministers speak, they often speak like they're speaking to women and kids. And I look around and they are. So, anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
sorry, Oliver. You've touched a nerve there. Yeah.
You see, he gave me all the questions ahead of time, so I thought I would change. I thought I'd change them all. Keep him on his front foot. So, how important is this topic more generally? In our culture, in an order of priorities, where does this rank? Would you say?
Well, it only affects 50% of the population.
Right.
No, I actually think it affects. It's looking to affect the next generation deliberately. When you're old and crusty like me, you just it's hard to actually take it seriously till you drill down a little bit. And it's real there, particularly for the younger blokes. Right? And actually, I finally found something that I can be a victim for the other day, right? Because I'm white, I'm male, I'm Anglo. Ageism. I found an article that said, if you're over 60, you're being discriminated against. Finally, I can be a victim. This whole thing is beginning to affect younger blokes, and it's. I didn't believe it when I read the American stuff, but it's here as well. We okay to? Here we go. Over the last generation or two, there's been a huge move to empower women. Great. I've got 3 daughters. Okay. They're all university educated. They're all doing really well. That's terrific. And you see it in our culture as well. So does anyone remember Lost in Space? The original in the 60s? Okay. Actually, funny thing, when I watched the Lost in Space in the 60s as a boy, I thought, hey, the 2 daughters are really cute. And then I saw an episode 10 years ago and I thought, hey, the mum, actually, she's pretty cute. And you realise that, all right, wait a minute, something's changed. But in the original Lost in Space, Maureen Lockhart, the wife, she was just eye candy. She literally did the washing in the spaceship. That's all she did. If you look at the remake, the 2021 Netflix version, Maureen, the mum, is now the scientist, the leader, and the captain of the whole show. And her husband is well-meaning muscle. That's the kind of change. Anyone know who Doctor Who is these days? Doctor Who's now a woman, Jodie Whittaker. Okay. Now, I'm all for female empowerment, okay, but it's also come at the cost of telling young men they don't really have a role anymore. And it's pushed young men into more and more, not all, but generally into passivity. So I spoke at a church, one of our FIC churches. If you don't know what FIC is, we're a group of independent churches together. If the Catholic Church is Coles and the Anglicans are Woolworths, we're IGA, okay? Right? So I speak at one of our IGA churches. There's 200 young ones in the church. They're all kind of 18 to 25. And I asked one of the women who worked for the church, what are the issues I need to hit with these young blokes? She said, pornography, online gaming, social media, and binging on Netflix and online television. Now, that's all internet, and guess what? It's all passive. It's all passive. So what our society is saying more and more is the girls have got it. They've got it all under control. In almost every action movie I watch now, there's a 50-kilo woman beats up 200 or 300-kilo men. Okay, which is just complete nonsense. But more and more young guys are saying, "Oh, well, all right, I'll step into the. I'm not needed," or you know, they say they don't need me, and they're drifting into this passive virtual world of pornography that's poison, of online gaming where you can be a hero in your jammies, right, in your mum's basement, social media which should be called anti-social media, or you just endlessly, you know, watching streaming television. Now that's a trend more and more. Are men doing well? Can I just, here's one I prepared earlier. We've got a school system.
Hang on.
Yep. Sorry, sorry, I care about this. I just, okay, I got 7 or 8 stats on where men are struggling, but
this sort of Q&A. I think we'll come to that in a minute. But can we? You've sort of put out into the public. What sort of response has there been? Is there a deafening silence, or is there an awakening of interest?
I've actually been surprised that the phone has rung. I've had guys message me. Sure, your mates will ring you. My mum's gone now, so she couldn't buy them all, but God bless her. But mates have rung and said, that's good, etc. But I'll tell you what's been the most, and I've been invited to speak at all sorts of conventions and things, etc. The most gratifying thing is when blokes have said, I bought this and I'm going to hand it to my son or my brother or my mate who's not a follower of Jesus. And they, if you like, this communicates enough of the wisdom that's in the Bible and our, etc., to trust it, to hand it to someone who's not a follower of Jesus. That's been really good. Yep.
So if people here buy 5 of these, right, who would you like them to get into the hands of? Read it yourself, and then I would hope you give it sons, brothers-in-law. It's a reasonably cheap Christmas present. Right. I just spent 10 days up at Cape York helping the environment, which is why I think to everybody I talk to in there, I said, could you repeat that, please? I'm half deaf from... and I gave a copy of each of it to the blokes who run the Soft City Boy Safaris thing up there. And one of the guys had read a third of it. I thought, yeah, that's what I wanted. Yeah. Good. Well, I think there's a bit of a mission for us all there, isn't there? To buy a few copies of this book, make sure it gets into the hands of hopefully some younger people. I'm not sure the older people will be able to change the way they look at life too much, but I think it's primarily you want to get it in the hands of young people. Young boys, don't you? Ideally, yeah. And men. Yeah. Right. Yep. And so let's just switch a little bit now. That's really been about the book. Let's talk about masculinity now. Why is there such a focus on sexuality, race, and gender today, Al, in your opinion? Yeah, big questions. The race thing is the most complicated one because you obviously need, there's still work to be done there, although things have changed a lot in the last 40 years. My wife is Chinese. When we started going out together in 1979, we met, we'd go out, we got married in 81, people would stare at us as a mixed race couple. And Kathy would get racist comments when we went back to the country where I'm from. Now that's changed dramatically in those 40 years. Yeah. You know, in the street we live in, half the marriages or half the relationships are mixed race now, which is great. How you help or move forward with Indigenous people, that's very complicated. But the gender thing, I mean, if you look at the academic world, Jordan Peterson and others will say the whole Marxism thing was such an obvious failure economically. They moved the Marxist agenda into the idea of race and then sex, etc. And the whole world is about power. And the activists want to tear down what we've got, but they don't have anything really to put in its place. You know, I haven't read enough on that to really comment. I suspect at a ground level,
when you move away from the big narratives that explain who we are and why this is all here, and in our society, that's been the Judeo-Christian worldview. Once you do away with that, how do you explain who you are and why you're here and how do you make sense of life? Well, we've moved more and more to individual, the individual who actually was grown out of Christianity. If you want to double click on that, I'm happy to talk about that. But the value of the individual has now become individualism, to the point where I choose who I am, right? Not just how I dress or how I present, but whether I'm male or female, even to that point. And so it's all about me and what I choose, and that's etc. And so I think we're in for a world of pain in that, because we're actually, the parts of our society are moving further and further away from reality. And the more you do that, reality bites. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's I guess this movement can be generally called progressivism. That's the sort of political expression of it.
Yeah, progressivism, or if you want to on the other side and poke fun, you call it the woke thing.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm calling it progressivism.
Yep.
But
progressivism.
So
no, that's what I would call it too.
So is there a difference between the progressive or woke view of masculinity and how men generally, and the people you meet, see themselves? Or is this just a sort of a kind of a slur, or as you said earlier on, a sort of a canard against men for some reason, which men themselves don't buy into?
I think it's quite divided by age. You know, if you're across the old baby boomer like me, there's a big difference between the progressive agenda and the way that I see the world. So I think the younger ones are more, and that's not that it's all bad, but that difference, I think, is age has a lot to do with it. But I'll tell you what else has a lot to do with it, and that's the nature of life. So testosterone and men taking the initiative, getting on the front foot, all of those things, that's only looked down on or done away with if life is very soft and very comfortable. So we've lived almost 80 years. I saw Peter Dutton last night in his speech say something about 80 years since the Second World War. And I thought, it is actually 78 years or something. We've lived 80 years of peace, security, and prosperity. Okay, it is only in an environment like that that you can say that masculinity, and men stepping up is not necessary, or in fact that it's evil. It's only in that environment. I'll give you an example. In Cape York, the whole progressive agenda isn't really on the table. Why? Because these guys up there are working with cattle. They're catching feral bulls that if you make a mistake, they will kill you. Right? They're not worrying about their pronouns as they do that. The guys pulled up at this hunting camp, and they had a huge trailer. Right? And I stepped up onto the drawbar of the trailer, and look, in the back is a feral bull. Now that's nearly 1,000 kilos of cranky testosterone, horns and everything. And as I stood there, its eyes were on about the same level as me, and it's kicking the trailer. Now, how did it get there? It's walked into one of the lagoons, got a belly full of water, as they described it, and started to walk out. Now, these things are worth about $1,000 if they put them if they can get them to the meat works. There's a young bloke who's like 20 years old. He's got his old Land Cruiser there. He chased the bull in the Land Cruiser, knocked it over, showed me a photo later, drove up onto it and put the front of the cruiser on the bull. Right? Then he gets out with a tow rope, ties the horns of the bull, and then ties it to a tree. Right? And then leaves it. Then they come back later with this trailer. I talked to the boss about how do they get it in the trailer. He said, you just throw a rope around its horns and then you drag it up. He said, but if you get it wrong, they'll come around the side of the trailer and they'll puncture the tyres of the trailer with their horns. Now you imagine if they can puncture a 5-ply tyre with their horns, what are they going to do to you? So my point being, life's got to be pretty soft and easy before you start to say that masculinity and testosterone doesn't matter. I did notice when the COVID thing started in 2020, I watched the whole transgender, the whole woke agenda just disappeared as soon as there was trouble.
For a time.
Yeah. And I did notice in Ukraine, there was one sex took the children, got on buses and went west. And there was another, picked up the automatic rifles and walked east. Now, am I saying that life's going to fall apart here? I don't know, but that's this book, Manhood in the Making, very interesting. David Gilmour, what he did was did a whole lot of research, a professor of anthropology, in all sorts of different societies, mostly pre-industrial, but some actually went and talked to the Maasai and et cetera, et cetera. And what he found was this, that the harder and more physically demanding life is, the more manhood was valued. So he said, I've got a quote here, he says, at the end of it, he says, manhood is the social barrier that societies must erect against entropy, human enemies, and the forces of nature and time, and all human weaknesses that endanger group life. So I just think we're in this little bubble of peace, prosperity, security, and so we can say, oh, you know, manhood and masculinity doesn't matter anymore. I suspect it may come back to bite us.
Moving on, is there such a thing as toxic masculinity?
Sure. Yeah, because men have power. We have the ability to affect people for good or for ill, and often men misuse that power that they have. But I'd put it as toxic humanity, because it's not just men that abuse power. Women abuse it as well in different ways because they've got different power. So men don't, in terms of being toxic, men don't have a monopoly on it. No. But yeah, we do it. And if you really want to know, it's all about selfishness. And men are, the default position of the human heart is selfishness. And if you don't think that, you're kidding yourself.
Has this sort of feminist revolution that you referred to provoked a masculine revolution?
Yeah, the feminist revolution's really been good for women. There's been some good things, but really what it's allowed them to do is to hold down a full-time job and run the house, to live with a bloke who can give him sex and housework and food when he's totally uncommitted and he can walk out whenever he wants. It's allowed lots of women to be single mothers and work themselves to death. It's allowed them for men to have sex however they want. It's allowed lots of women to get to mid-30s and can't find a man who'll commit. So it's really been a win for them overall.
What about
leave that on the website, Pete? Now, what's the response from men? Yeah. There are some men's rights movements, and there's guys who write to Clementine Ford, the feminist writer who lives in Melbourne, and everything, but it just seems a little bit kind of a bit wet, really. I think for many young men, what's the reaction been like? Well, it's like when I hang up the washing, okay, and I know that my wife is going to come and rehang it. Anyone? Yeah. Yeah. So what do you do? Well, if you're going to rehang it, you do it. I'll you know, there's television that needs watching. So the reaction, I think, has not been to have a kind of counter wave of men. It's more, well, a retreat into passivity, because blokes tend to only do what they need to do. And so do you notice those four things that the lady said I should talk to her young men about? Pornography, gaming, social media, and watching streaming television. They're all passive. And there is actually an increase, you can check on the net, of young men living with their parents longer and longer and longer. The whole failure to launch thing. So I don't think it's been, I think it's been a passive, well, you girls have got it. You know, we've got all the female superheroes now, etc. Well, okay, over to you. I just go and watch porn and save the world in my jammies playing on the internet. By the way, you heard me say porn is poison, didn't you? Anyway, that's
so. The girls, the young women, have been given sort of special treatment over the last few years in terms of, telling them what they ought to be doing, thinking, acting, and so on. Is anything like that helping young boys to graduate from being sort of self-centered and stupid to being something of a
man? Yeah. Richard, in terms of moving from boys to men, I think as a culture we've lost thinking through how that happens.
Right.
What's the difference? I've quoted Steve Biddulph again and again. I think he's right. Heard him on a rate. They said, "What's the difference between boys and men?" He said, "Boys care about themselves, men care for other people." Okay. So I know a 50-year-old boy, and I've known 18, 19, 20-year-old men. I think that's the test. Okay. Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan priest must be nearly 80 years old now, wrote a book called Adam's Return. And in it, he said, he didn't mention exactly where the research was done, but it's a good book. He said he'd looked at ancient cultures and they all had a kind of an initiation thing to turn boys into men. And he said there were 5 hard truths that just kept coming up again and again. Incidentally, when I looked, all these 5 hard truths are there very clearly in the Bible as well. He said, what was it that boys need to learn before they can be useful men? Well, these 5 things were, 1, that life is hard. And it is interesting how that resilience thing keeps coming up for younger ones that we've tried to make parents have overcompensated. Life is hard. You're not that important. Okay. Your life is not about you, meaning what? That really you're here to serve and protect and care. You're not in control and you're going to die.
Sounds like the army.
Well, isn't it interesting? It's actually facing up to reality. Life is hard, yes. And if you don't believe that, the first time something difficult comes, is going to knock you over. You're not that important. Hey, aren't I special and everything? Well, no, actually, you're not. Your life is not about you. Actually, you're here to serve rather than be selfish. You're not in control. Get over it. You can't control life, and you're going to die. Now, as I said, all 5 of those are very clearly in the Bible. The Bible has a negative about it. Hey, get used to this. This is hard. And then a positive about it, the difference that actually faith in a creator God makes. Yeah.
You said earlier on that we're moving on to a little bit about maybe masculinity in the Bible, and what the Bible says about masculinity. You said earlier on that the church, the institutional side of Christianity, is sort of giving a sort of a very weak kind of a message to men, which is focused on behaviors that are not sort of done by Christians and so on and so forth. But when a person becomes a Christian, there's a sort of a transition, isn't there? And this sort of changes the spirit of a man, or it changes the spirit of a human. How does this affect the way men see themselves? Does it?
I think the Christian faith is often presented either as, Jesus will be your boyfriend, okay, or Jesus will be your life coach and make you healthy, wealthy, wonderful. No, Jesus is your commanding officer, your Lord, the boss, and what he calls his men to, is to make a difference and to care for, to serve him, and as you serve him, to look after the people around you. That's really what he calls us to do. Now that's a positive message that that men need to hear. I think that's the difference. And the big call is stop being selfish. Stop being selfish.
Yeah.
What's interesting, when I looked at the Bible, and I see the way the Bible sees men is this: you're an individual, yes, and you relate to your Creator, and he calls you to trust him and what he said, yes, and made himself known in Jesus. But then the Bible sees men particularly in relationships. So every man here has been a son, okay? You'll be a workmate, you'll be a friend. Some of us will be husbands, some of us will be fathers. And the Bible speaks to men in those relationships. Now, what I found when I looked, every one of those relationships, the Bible assumes men have power. Okay. So the Bible speaks to young men and says, young men, be self-controlled. Why? Because you're strong. Well, the assumption is, yeah, you know, when you're young, you're strong, but you're a buffhead. You need to be self-controlled. Older men, what? Doesn't say that you're strong. It says set an example. Because older men, the power we have is influence. Okay. Then masters, you have the power. Master, how do you treat your slaves or your employees? Be very careful how you do that, because you've got a boss up there who's watching. And particularly husbands and fathers have power. And the Bible's very clear about be very careful how you use that to look after, lift up, care, nurture those people who you should be looking after. Mm-hmm. So that's the Bible's message. That's the second half of the book, saying, you might think, oh, you know, I can't make much of a difference in the world. Yes, you can. You make a big difference. Oh, yeah, but it'll only be a little part. Yeah, but it'll be the part that matters to you and the people that matter to you. And that's what masculinity is about. I'm going to step up, take responsibility, and I'm going to look after these people that I care for. Yeah.
I got one last question, sort of half of the comment, and then we'll throw the meeting open for the general questions. But a number of years ago, I used to be involved with the student leadership forum down in Canberra. We'd get together and they'd meet leaders and they'd talk about leadership, and particularly servant leadership. And we who were there as sort of people, and towards the end of these sessions, my wife Suzanne used to always talk to the girls about how do you find a good man, right? And they were always fascinated by that question. And my question was, how do you reconcile with your father? And they were equal. The boys there were always fascinated by that question. And I had one case where I talked about this, and there was a Saudi guy there, right? And he was having a lot of problems with his father. And I said, I put this thought to him: maybe you should reconcile with him, starting off by forgiving him and then talking to him and trying to reconcile with him. Long story short, I got an email back from Saudi Arabia several months later saying, I was amazed. My son called me up and we've reconciled with each other. And he said, I didn't know that Christians actually were good people. So sort of interesting. But I'd like you to make a couple of remarks about this to the people here in this room about how to deal with your fathers, because I'm sure there's a lot of feelings in this room about fathers and how they've treated us and so on.
I'm due to go and visit my dad next week. He lives up the north coast. It is interesting. Every young man that I know whose wife is pregnant, about to have a baby, or has a little toddler, he plans to have a marvelous relationship with his son as he grows. But so many grown men that I speak to have poor relationships with their father. I still speak with my dad regularly, but my dad and my brother have not spoken to each other for 7 or 8 years. And I suspect, short of a miracle, I suspect they never will. I think as you grow, you come to understand that your father is a fellow traveller and generally he was doing his best, that you're able to forgive them the failures that they have when you see the failures in your own life. What has, I can't say too much if this is going to go on the net, etc. But I think what has helped is, it's interesting, if you had to come up with 10 rules for life, I know this has been done, right? Okay. If you had to come up with 10 rules for life and you could only have one rule about family life, okay, what would you choose? Well, my guess is most people say, oh, love your children and care for them. But that is not what God says. He says that elsewhere. But in the 10 commandments, the 5th commandment is this: honor your father and mother, etc. Now, he doesn't say obey them always because you grow out of obedience. But honour is to treat them with respect and acknowledge what they've done and acknowledge that you're standing on their shoulders, etc. And so I think that is why, because we need the reminder. Everyone loves their kids. Well, almost everyone loves their kids automatically. You need to be reminded, hey, look back and appreciate what they did and cut them some slack and treat them with honour. And it doesn't say, by the way, honour your father and mother if they deserve it. It just says, honour your father and mother. And so that you may live long in the land. Yes, exactly. And the fact is, if they had listened to their parents, etc., they would have lived there a lot longer. But they didn't. So anyway, that's
well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Al. That's, I think, a wonderful.
Sorry, I get wound up.
Q&A. No, you're going to get other opportunities to get wound up because we're going to open the floor to question generally. But let's give Al.
But it seems to me that women seem to think they have no idea. How much do you think it's men saying, well, hey, if you think you've got it on, you know what we're about, have at it. It's all yours.
I think the problem is my wife understands me too well. You know, they say your secretary doesn't understand. Any man who says my wife doesn't understand me, your secretary doesn't understand you, your wife does. That's the problem. Right? My wife says that I'm shallow, as if it's a negative. I don't know. Anyway, just say, well, what you see is what you get. I don't know. The two, I'm a clergyman, I'm allowed to quote the Bible, okay. The two wrong reactions you see in the Bible is early in the book of Genesis is one, the man who's overly aggressive and dominating, Lamech, but the more likely sin of men is to be passive. If you read and I think it's a parable about Adam and Eve and the fruit and the snake, and that it's a superb parable about how we relate to God. Eve takes the fruit and eats it, right? And then gives it to Adam. Well, what was he doing the whole time? He's standing there with his finger in his ear. Like, what's he doing? He's passive and the whole thing falls apart. He should have got in there and right? And so men can respond to this over-dominating toxic thing, but I think we're much more likely to be passive and leave it to the girls. And that is not healthy masculinity. It's a willingness to step up and get involved, I think.
Al, thanks.
I want to tip.
Is it on? Yeah.
Yep.
Your comment. Yeah, you go.
Tim was quicker, Owen. He just beat you by a nanosecond.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Al. I want to ask you about fatherhood. When I had my first child, it struck me how, wow, the world is not about me. It's actually about my children. And it was just an incredible impact. Last night, I saw Professor Mary Eberstadt speak at the Ramsay function in Macquarie Street. She wrote a book called How Society Lost God. One of the things she said, which really struck me, was babies humanize us. Babies humanize us. Could you talk, I read your chapter on fatherhood. Could you talk a little bit more about how we can be better fathers to our children in a very challenging environment?
Yeah. Babies do humanize us. I've got a chapter in there about, footnote in there about there's actual hormonal changes happen in a man's brain when you become a father, etc. I think babies do teach us that we're not the center of the world, because you're given this 3 or 4 kilos screaming dependent alarm clock to work out, that you. I think the biggest thing for fathering, and I've got 4 kids now, right, 38 through to 30. The biggest thing is be around. Farrell and Gray in the book The Boy Crisis have study after study, and I mean pages of stuff on the difference that a present father makes in a family. You know, from the psychological health of kids, to prison, you know, the likelihood of ending up in prison, of drugs, of the kids growing up functionally. It's a massive thing. So that's the biggest thing. And I think your job is to try and move. You've got a toddler here who makes no decisions with no consequences. You've got 16, 18 years to move them to the fact of where they will make adult decisions with adult consequences? How do you slowly move them in an age-appropriate way so they feel the consequences of decisions, good and ill, so that they're capable of operating in an adult world? How do you do that? And at the same time, being aware of the power balance that changes from you have all the power, you decide everything, to the fact that, and I can see it now on the horizon, they'll choose a nursing home. That's the power. So I've said everything I know about parenting in there, but yeah.
We have an online question. Viva. Unmute yourself, Viva.
Thank you. Al, you opened the meeting with a very rousing statement about the emasculation of men, and you're absolutely right that society has done this. Do you think that we can address this through our educational system? Can you hear me?
Yep, through our educational system.
Yes, because you talked about the fact that men think about other people and boys think about themselves. National service did a lot in equalizing that, because people started, boys going in at the age of 16, 18 or whatever, went into the army and started to realize there's a big world out there and it's not about them. That's gone.
Yep.
And I'm not advocating that it should come back, but surely there is some way in our educational system to be able to create an awareness among all children, men and women, that it's not about them. How can we do that?
Yeah, I think over the years we have loaded up our education system more and more and more. It is interesting that we've got an education system. I don't think it's a conspiracy, but an education system that does favour girls over boys. So now 58% of university graduates, 58% of university graduates are women. And in higher degrees, the gap is even wider. If you want to read more on the problems that develop early, Leonard Sachs and his book, Boys Adrift, and some other stuff that he's written, there's things like boys mature possibly 2 years behind girls of the same age. And so when you start boys and girls at the same age in the same class, the girls are way ahead. The boys do catch up eventually. Also, little boys don't hear as well as little girls. Now, as a bloke who's half deaf from self-inflicted gunshot noise, I can empathise. Right? What was that? But little boys don't hear. Now, he says that you put little boys in the same classroom as girls, they're not as mature anyway, and then little Miss Soft Voice, who's the teacher, stands up the front and begins to talk, and he can't hear her properly, and so he wanders off. Hey, a bird needs to fall behind. Now there's systemic problems in that. Also, I've got an 11-year-old grandson, and if I could say, he's got ants in his pants. He needs to go all the time. To sit him in a desk 6 hours a day and ask it, the way that we teach and educate boys doesn't fit most active young boys either. I don't have the answers. I can just tell you some of the problems.
Okay. Owen was next in line, so. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, well, Tim took part of it, which was the idea around fatherhood. But a stat that just hits me right between the eyes, Al, is 75% of young men are the numbers in youth suicide in this country. What do we do to create generational change? We've got young guys going off to their caves, they're disengaging. We've got the advent of, all of the different things you mentioned around gaming, Netflix, porn. And, I've got an 11-year-old boy. I can barely get him out of the room when he's playing Fortnite. It is so addictive and it's literally destroying their lives. I'm seeing it happen in slow motion.
Isn't it interesting? What Fortnite offers is, with a group of other guys, you get to go and conquer this particular fort, or you're on a mission and you do it together. And the only problem is it's not real. So, mate, I don't know how you control, how you control that, but it might be switching the internet off, something like that. Okay. Suicide is now the biggest killer of Australian men between 18 and 24 years old. Here's a stat. There are 3 times as many men kill themselves as women. 2,300 men in 2017. More women attempt suicide, men get the job done. Here's the stat. COVID 2020. What do you think? Which killed more men? Suicide or COVID? Men. Suicide. I don't know what the answer is exactly. Okay. I want to give young men purpose. Now that's exactly what Jesus calls men to. Even if you're not a fan. And what's Jordan Peterson's message? That's his message. And who's responded? Overwhelmingly young men. He's out here again sometime soon. You tickets sold like that in every city in the Western world, wherever he goes. Oh, that's what I'm made for. Right? I think that's, let's get on the front foot. Now, I know, are you okay and everything? Yep, good. But yeah.
So I just want to put it out there. Is there a risk that in focusing on what they have done to the male in terms of emasculation, that it deflects us as males from what I think is the core message from the Bible going back to Adam, that the root problem for the male is abrogation of responsibility. And it doesn't really have to do with what others are doing to you. It's our sinfulness.
I agree, absolutely. The real problem is, if you've said abrogation of responsibility. I think I use the words passivity. You're right. This isn't a call to victimhood. This is a call to step up and do something. Right? And that's what men should do. Right? So there's nothing about, woe is us in this and let's mope around and whatever. No, get on the front foot, get your act together, take responsibility, make life better for the people around you. That's how you'll find purpose. I agree 100%. And that is what Jesus calls men to do.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about observations on the invasion of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. last year.
Thanks for bringing that up. Yep.
Yes, as I was looking at the footage there, I noticed that 95% of the people involved were men. That there were very, very few women in that crowd. If we looked at the event through the lens of your book, what do you think we would see?
I'm not sure I want to go there, mate, on that one. I don't know. It's probably more likely that blokes are likely wanting to get physically involved or whatever. I'm not sure I can answer that one without some thought.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions? One more. Nick, let's make this the last one.
If I can bring this back to you as the author a little bit, one of the patterns that I've noticed with people in C, if I can kind of bastardize biblical language, to harden their heart. They're very sure of their own position. Did you manage to avoid that writing the book? And if so, how?
One of the upsides of getting older, I think, is that life knocks a bit of humility into you, I think. And I have tried to say, I will acknowledge when it's just my crusty old baby boomer opinions versus what I actually think the Bible is saying. I think I've tried to say that. Okay? Doesn't mean my crusty old opinions are wrong, but I've tried to acknowledge the difference there. And the editors went through it 3 times because I think they were a bit worried about what I might say. So I think you're right, Nick. You got to. This is a grey kind of slippery area as well. Yeah. So.
Okay. Well, let's give Al.
Father, thank you for the example that you set us through your Son, Jesus Christ. Thank you for the insights that Al, as your servant, has brought us today. Thank you for his love for people and the wisdom that he brings to the discussion. Help us all as men, as husbands, as fathers, as servants, as masters, or just as men, to live our lives with a sense of purpose, with a desire to be the men that you called us to be, and help us to take on the burdens to be the best men that we can be, and to inspire others, particularly the young men that we know.